Morning of June 18th, 1815. History is sometimes written with just a few hours of delay. If the sun had risen a little earlier that morning, if the ground had dried more quickly, and if Napoleon had fired his cannons on time. The Europe we talk about today, the maps we see, and the world we live in could have been completely different. Waterloo, not an end. What if it had been a new beginning? Date, February 26, 1815. Europe believed that everything was over for Napoleon. He had once been the emperor who shook the continent. But now, he was in exile on a tiny island in the Mediterranean called Elba. He had lost his throne. His army had scattered. His empire had collapsed. For the kings of Europe, Napoleon was a closed chapter. But they were wrong. On the night of February 26, 1815, Napoleon secretly left Elba Island with a loyal force of about 1,000 men. He had with him a few officers, selected guards, and a core group that still believed in him. And Napoleon had a single goal: to return to Paris, to reclaim his throne, and to show Europe that he was not finished yet. When Napoleon landed on the shores of France, he had two options before him. The first was to advance through the Rhone Valley. It was a faster and more direct route. But it was also the strongest royalist region. If he went that way, he could be surrounded at the very beginning and destroyed before even reaching Paris. Napoleon chose the second path. The harder one, the quieter one, the more dangerous one. He followed the mountain road known today as the Route Napoleon. He advanced through the rugged passes of the Alps, narrow paths, and small towns. This was not just a geographical choice. It was a political and military stroke of genius. Because thanks to this route, he stayed away from royalist centers and avoided drawing the attention of local garrisons. Napoleon was no longer just marching to Paris. Step by step, he was rebuilding his own legend, but the place that determined the fate of this march was Lafri, near Grenoble. The king's soldiers stood before him. Their rifles were loaded. The barrels were aimed at him. Everything could have ended there. Napoleon dismounted his horse. He slowly walked toward the soldiers. Then he opened his coat, exposed his chest, and shouted, "Soldiers, if there is anyone among you who wants to kill his emperor, here I am." Then a single cry broke the silence. "Vive l'Empereur!" The soldiers lowered their weapons and switched sides. And from that moment on, this march was no longer an escape. It became a return. After Lafri, the psychological barrier was broken. The troops sent against him joined him one by one. This was no longer just a military advance. This was the story of charisma, loyalty, and a collapsing regime falling apart before everyone's eyes. The most striking example was Marshal Ney, his former comrade. Once one of the fiercest commanders, he had sworn to bring Napoleon back in an iron cage. But he joined him instead. And every new force sent against him only made him stronger. When Napoleon entered Paris on March 20th, 1815, King Louis XVIII had already fled, and Napoleon, without firing a single shot, had conquered France for the second time. From that moment on, the period known as the 100 Days began. Technically, it lasted about 111 days, but symbolically, everyone remembered it by the same name, Les 100 Jours, the 100 Days. And this short period would become the final stage where Napoleon's political genius, charisma, and desperation were all seen at once. Napoleon had only one reality before him: to act before Europe could unite. In this short time, Napoleon displayed an incredible pace. First, he rebuilt his army. Upon returning from exile, he reorganized the scattered French forces. He formed an army of around 200,000 men. But he didn't just gather soldiers. He made political moves as well. He promised a more liberal administration. He amended the Constitution with the Additional Act. But his most critical move was diplomacy. He sent peace proposals to European powers. "I no longer seek conquest. I only wish to govern France," he said. But none of these offers mattered, because Europe had already made its decision. On March 13, 1815, a historic decision was made at the Congress of Vienna. Napoleon Bonaparte, not as a head of state, but as an enemy of humanity and the people, was declared an outlaw. This was a rare moment in history, because this declaration meant Napoleon was no longer a diplomatic actor, but a threat to be eliminated wherever he was found. For European monarchs, this was a war to preserve order, because Napoleon was not just a commander. He was the living continuation of the French Revolution, equality, nationalism. He carried these ideas across Europe, and these ideas were a deadly threat to monarchies. Also, Napoleon had broken many agreements of the past. No one trusted him. His peace offers were seen as a tactic to buy time. That is why Europe's decision was clear. Napoleon had to be eliminated. Europe's greatest powers united. England, Prussia, Austria, Russia, each prepared massive armies. The plan was simple. This time Napoleon would not just be defeated, he would be completely erased from the stage. But Napoleon did not wait for their plan. Napoleon knew one thing. If he waited, Europe's massive armies would unite and surround France. So he did not defend. He attacked. His target was Belgium, because two major armies were there: Wellington's Anglo-Allied forces and Blücher's Prussian army. If these two forces united, everything would be over for Napoleon. But if he could defeat them separately, everything could change. Morning of June 18, 1815. Napoleon was ready to attack, but the rain that fell throughout the night had turned the battlefield into mud. He waited to move his artillery for hours. This delay seemed like a small detail, but it wasn't. When the French army finally attacked, Wellington had already set his defense. The British lines did not break. Cavalry charges failed. Napoleon waited with one hope: Marshal Grouchy. But the army appearing on the horizon was not his, but Blücher's Prussian army. And in that moment, the fate of the battle changed. Napoleon played his final card, the Imperial Guard. But when even they retreated, everything was over. But now, let's rewind everything. To that morning, to that delay. What if Napoleon had not waited? What if the attack had begun hours earlier? What if the Prussians had not arrived in time, and Waterloo had not been a defeat, but a victory? When the news spread, Europe froze. This was not just the loss of a battle. This was the announcement of Napoleon's return. Panic began in London. Financial markets trembled. The people, for the first time, considered a real possibility of invasion. In France, this victory would not be just a military success. This would be the rebirth of a legend. Napoleon would no longer be just a leader. He would once again be invincible. Republicans, imperial supporters, would unite around a single point: power. And this time, bringing him down from within would become almost impossible. The real change would not happen on the battlefield, but at the diplomatic table. Napoleon would act differently this time. He would immediately offer peace. But this time, not from weakness, from strength. He would use his ties with Austria. He would buy time with Russia. The coalition would begin to fracture from within. Europe would no longer be a single front. But this would not bring peace. On the contrary, it would begin a longer and more complex era of conflict. Smaller wars, rebellions, coups. Europe would enter an age of instability. But this time, Napoleon would be at the center of it all. Over time, Napoleon would not just build an empire, he would build a system. One law, one economic order, one center. Paris, perhaps Europe, would have united 150 years earlier, but not through democracy, through power. But this order would have a cost. Napoleon's greatest mistake would be creating his own enemies. Germans, Italians, would discover their identities earlier. But this time, against French dominance, Europe would fragment earlier and far more violently. If Britain weakened, the balance of power at sea would shift. Colonies would grow under different powers. Perhaps even America would not reach the power it has today. The Ottoman Empire might survive longer, but this time, it would face French influence. The world map would be redrawn. If Napoleon had won, we might be living in a more modern Europe. But there would be a cost: constant war, dominance of a single power, and perhaps an empire that never ends. History is written by the victors, but sometimes lost possibilities are the greatest force shaping the present. So what if Waterloo was never truly an end?